What we're going to talk about today is our bearings and seals. Just some general information. I know some of you guys haven't done a lot of automotive work, so you may not, this may be your first time doing something like repacking wheel bearings or replacing universal joints. So we're going to talk a little bit in general about different types of bearings and how to install them, and some little tricks and tips to make the job go easier. When it comes to bearings, there's in modern use, there's the tapered roller bearing. These are very common for wheel bearings. They're sometimes used in transmissions. You'll see these all over in a car. This race is pressed into a hub. It's usually your hub for your on your front wheels. You can press them in using a tool like this, meant to tap them in with a hammer. Always go easy. Don't force. Make sure they're going in straight. If something's a little bit tight, we can use a little trick. If we want to make this a tiny bit smaller, you can make this part cold. You got a real cold freezer, stick it in the freezer. Take the hub, set it out in the sun. This will shrink a bit in the cold. The hub will expand in the heat. Might be enough that it'll drop right in to where it needs to go without having to tap it in or force it. I've used that trick a lot of times. Dry ice, a little toaster oven. When we put the harmonic balancer on our 59, we put it in the toaster oven at 200 degrees for about 20 minutes. And it slipped right onto the front of the crankshaft. No pounding, no trouble, no special tool needed. When you're taking these races out of like a hub, you want to be careful. A lot of guys have the nice steel punches, and there's usually a cutout in the hub to allow you to move from side to side to punch these out. And generally, your only option is to punch these out. You want to use a brass punch. This is a great big brass drift that I've got, but I'll throw this in the lathe and turn it down to whatever point I need on it to do a job. So look for pieces of scrap brass. Make great punches. May not be the prettiest thing in the world, but it'll help you not damage a part. It'll keep you from chipping things and make the job go a lot easier. This side usually, when we're dealing with wheel bearings, slips onto the spindle without any force at all. And so this is the Timken. Timken was the company that invented these roller bearings. Now, on some of the older cars, the front wheel bearings will be these ball bearings. I think switched over in 59, I think. 58 or 59 Cadillac switched over from these. These were used on the earlier cars. And you deal with the race in the same way as you do these. And so this is a ball bearing. This is out of a commercial chassis, a rear axle. And this is a center bearing from a driveline, and with the covers taken off. These sealed bearings have these rubber covers, and often they can be popped off, and you can see all the bearings in their cage. Now, if you run into trouble with a bearing like this, you got one that's making noise, giving you trouble. You're trying to just, maybe take a car out for a quick test drive, trying to get it where you can drive it to see what else it needs. You got a bearing like this, you can pop the covers off, clean them out, and grease them up temporarily. Get you on the road if you had a problem. So something you have to be very, very careful with is when these are pressed into a housing or onto an axle or whatever they happen to be used on, you want to be very careful when you're installing them or removing them where you apply force using your press. If this was, let's say, on a axle shaft, and this was pressed onto the axle shaft and you're trying to get it off, if you set it in your press and you just back it up with the plate like that on this outer race, you run a real risk of having the force will be on the balls, and you run a real risk of having one of these races split or break because they're very hard, which makes them very brittle. And so you can have the race split and these balls come shooting out at a high velocity, which is not a good thing. So if you're pressing this bearing off of a axle, you'll want to support it on the inside, not the outside. And same with when you're installing them. You always want to be careful where you're applying force and gentle force, and always watching that things are going together squarely. When it comes to seals, sometimes be working on an old car that's going to have leather seals. And on a seal, this would be the outside, this would be the inside. If it has a spring, that's always on the inside. Sometimes when you're dealing with a leather seal that you've removed, it might be confusing as to which way a new rubber seal would go in. And when you're installing a seal, you always want to make sure the surface in here is oiled. You have a little lubrication, otherwise it'll run dry on the shaft and score it and ruin the seal and possibly damage the shaft. When we're installing these, oftentimes this is a wheel seal. We'll just go around and tap it in real gentle with a hammer. If you're using a press, you can, pick a, like here you don't want to go in too far, so you can go oversized, so it'll bottom out. Or you can get one that'll fit slightly inside, so you can push the seal down into a housing. The leather seal will, of course, absorb oil from the inside. And it'll also pick up road dust from the outside. And sometimes that leather seal will run a groove into whatever it's sealing against. If that's the case, sometimes these new rubber ones are so thin, you can place this in the housing carefully to get on an undamaged part of the shaft, and that saves you the trouble of having to install a speedy sleeve and going to that time and expense. So careful placement of a replacement rubber seal where there is a leather seal, sometimes you can get away with saving a part that may be otherwise worn. And the last thing we'll talk real quick about are U-joints. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to grab enough parts the other day to grab a yoke that this would be mounted into. But something you'll see guys doing is they'll have the clips off and they'll be trying to get this out of the yoke. And they'll have a drift and a 5-pound sledge and be just pounding like mad. And they're trying to get this cup to move. Well, all the force they're applying is having to go through the yoke to get to where it's bottomed out. You can compress the yoke and damage it. So when you're working on U-joints, you need to be very, very careful that you don't damage the yoke by pounding or pressing in the wrong place. Especially with a press, you can do a lot of damage real quick. And so you really got to take your time. Whenever you're dealing with pressing in bearings, seals, and these are bearings, so a whole set of needles in there. You always want to think about where your forces are going, because it's really easy to damage parts. And sometimes the parts that you get may be a rare or one-off part that you may have been hunting for. You don't want to damage it, so you always want to think about how you're applying forces, and if you're applying a force here, where is it going? How is it being transferred to the other side of the press or onto the workbench? So hopefully that will give you guys just some little insight to help you, especially if you haven't done a lot of automotive work before, to make the job of working with bearings and seals a little bit easier. And you can refer back to our disc brake conversion on our 59 is a great video to talk about doing wheel bearings. So I hope that information might come in handy for you.
At Caddy Daddy Presents, it's all about giving back. Please enjoy the video of the Boys and Girls Clubs of St. Helena and Calistoga. donate by clicking the link in the video description.